The Mafia boss believed no one knew about the listening devices hidden in his wife's room. Every breath, every whisper, every movement was recorded. Until one morning, the caregiver paused, looked straight at the corner of the room, and did something he never expected. The Mafia boss installed secret bugs to monitor his sick wife, until the caregiver reacted. It was 3 in the morning, and the house held its breath under a grid of blue light. Screens lined the back room like an altar, their faces pale and careful. Bramwell Rossy sat before them as if they were a ledger, and he a cautious accountant, scrolling through the hours of another night, noting the small expenditures of care. The way his wife's hand curled against the pillow, the slow, even rise of her chest, the 6-minute breath where she paused as if listening to something only she could hear. He watched because watching turned the world into numbers he could manage, times, distances, risks reduced to figures, and in a life worth defending that felt like a kind of mercy. The monitors reflected in his glasses. The images were intimate, and because intimacy could be possessed, they were also weapons. He named angles, rehearsed contingencies, cataloged benign things with the same clinical intensity he used to count men and transactions. A teacup with lipstick at the rim, a folded paper bird on the bedside table, an old photograph of her and a long-ago sea, sun-scratched. He would pause, sometimes, on her face, reading lines like entries in a book he meant to keep from fraying. Outside the room, the house slept, doors locked, staff at staggered hours. But here the house was awake with his presence alone. He had installed cameras to ensure she was safe. That was the story he told himself. He had installed them to prove care when proof felt like the only language of love he knew how to speak. Proof could be shown to skeptical friends, to rivals, to the world that assumed softness meant weakness. The devices kept a record of every small failure and every small triumph. They told him what had happened when he could not be there. They were the molecules of his protection. Cassidy McKenna arrived the next morning with a satchel heavy with clean sleeves and the smell of rain crusted at its seam. She carried herself like someone who had practiced being unassuming until it became a discipline. Straight shoulders wreathed in a cardigan that had seen better winters, boots wiped clean and hands that habitually folded under in a way meant to give and not to take. She insisted before anything else on seeing the patient. Bramwell, used to giving orders and watching their immediate effect, found himself thumbing a key he had not intended to press, the one labeled concession. "Mr. Rossy," she said, meeting him in the foyer, her speech plain as a ledger entry. "I'll need to examine her before I begin. Not to snoop, to make a plan. She isn't a machine you can watch from a room." There was something in the refusal that unsettled him. He had become used to decisions made for him, to staff who aligned their calendars with his temperaments. Cassidy's voice carried a quiet insistence that was not disrespectful and therefore all the more infuriating. But she had a license, a track record, and references stamped like signatures on her papers. Bramwell unlocked the sitting room, slower than he meant to, and watched her meet the woman she had come to tend. His wife, Evelyn, though he thought of her in small possessive ways that did not always sound like her name, was a geography of habits and relics. The illness had reoriented how she moved through the apartment. Cushions scaffolded her posture. A small lamp and a stack of novels sat in a corner that had once been for music, and the thermos that had been her constant companion at the bedside was, on this day, an object of ritual. Cassidy recognized all of it at once, but she handled each item as if it were a sacred thing rather than an asset. Her hand rested on the thermos the way someone might steady a cathedral column. The first morning passed in the soft work of learning, checking the angle of a wrist, testing the pressure of the pillow, whispering encouragements that were not performances. Cassidy hums an old Italian lullaby under her breath as she works. The melody became a thread in the room, a private stitch that seemed to reorient the day. Bramwell sat in the doorway, unused to being an audience for tenderness. He reported observations to his screens, the chair's fabric pattern, the slight flare in Evelyn's nostril when she tried to laugh. He noted Cassidy's technique in a ledger that was equal parts suspicion and grudging admiration. She knew how to measure patience, how to pace a hand over a scar as if counting, not rushing. Cassidy kept small disciplines of her own. At noon she would step out with a notebook and write a few lines by a cafe window, no more than a page, before returning. She wrote with a blunt pen, pages numbered in the upper corner like ration coupons. Sometimes she read aloud to Evelyn, choosing passages from books about repair, about work that had no finish line. She called the sessions hours. She would say, "We'll do an hour now, then rest," 2 hours of attention, then we leave space. Bramwell found the vocabulary unnerving because it made care sound like currency rather than charity. He recorded the rhythm and returned to his screens, where the footage confirmed neat things. Cassidy's hands were skilled, Evelyn's pulse slowed during the lullaby. There were 3 minutes where she tried to raise a mug and failed, and then a minute later she tried again and managed a tremor, an almost hold, of liquid against lips. He got better at the small things. Cassidy wrote in the journal she kept in pockets of time between shifts. One short entry, the ink slightly smudged. "We work on the cup today." He clenched and unclenched. Marcus counted with me. 1, 2, until he fell asleep. She didn't sign. Her entries read like inventories, not confessions. Bramwell watched the journal only by accident. He believed he had a right to know everything in his house, and that belief is a corrosive thing. It finds rationale in love and entitlement alike. He did not read Cassidy's pages openly at first. He watched how people moved through the room, noted the cadence of her hands, and made small notations of his own. It troubled him how much he was learning from stillness. The ticks on his monitors did not prepare him for the way a human hand could teach softness. The photograph appeared in a clip at dusk, a brief frame where Cassidy, leaving the sitting room, reached into her satchel and ran a thumb along a folded print. Bramwell froze the feed because the thumb had the peculiar habit of worrying the photograph's edge, the same guilty motion someone uses to steady a coin in memory. The image itself was ordinary. A young man sitting on a hospital bed, the light through Venetian blinds drawing stripes across his arm. He looked younger in the photograph than the person Bramwell later tried to find in his ledger, a face Fleming, eyes still raw. The man's name, when Bramwell traced it through paper and memory, came back to him as a docket he had filed away under unfortunate incidents. Marcus Webb. The name was not new to his files. Bramwell kept a column for mistakes and another for opportunities, and Marcus had been placed in a pale-margined box labeled Cause and Consequence. There were no triumphs attached, no trophies or reconciliations, only an ugly arithmetic of costs. Bramwell had always thought of that ledger as truth, numbers that charted what his world demanded and what it repaid. The photograph unsettled the ledger because it implied a human, not merely a line on a page. It implied someone else's life had continued when his records had ended. That evening, Bramwell replayed the moment until the edges blurred. He watched Cassidy sit at Evelyn's bedside, watching the slow concentration as if she were mending cloth. He watched the way she paused to pull out a small folded paper bird and set it on the bedside, its corners bent by care, and Evelyn's fingers navigate the fold with a hesitation that was almost a smile. Bramwell's mouth tasted of metal. Suspicion is a flavor that shadows the tongue. He called up files. He read sparse documents and the remembered long shadows of the night that had produced them. The ledger's language was clinical. Dates, locations, outcomes. It was the kind of record one makes when trying to make violence fit a budget, an accounting that pretends the moral quality of life can be graphed alongside property inventories. Bramwell had once justified those lists to himself as necessary. Each time he had crossed a line, he had constructed a purpose after the fact. Protection, survival, the defense of those he loved. Now, the ledger looked brittle. The presence of the photograph, Cassidy's careful thumb, the hospital light, made paper talk like someone's conscience. Cassidy, for her part, lived with contradiction. She kept her grief in the order of things: mornings, rehabilitation centers, a stack of municipal forms, appointments. She had a brother she visited on alternate Thursdays. No one knew how many nights she sat with her hands in her lap until she could no longer tell herself that waiting was a form of action. Marcus. His name arrived into her sentences like a small, stubborn cough. He was both a person she had once known and a weight she carried in the folds of a satchel. She avoided dramatizing the past. Instead, she cataloged small attempts at mending: teachers for speech, a therapist who taught grip, a barber who coaxed a smile. Her private pages contained lists of appointments and small notes. Marcus tolerates soup if it's lukewarm. Music helps. Taught him to squeeze hand for stop signal. She also wrote fragments that resembled prayers, though she would bristle at that term. A night entry read, "He stopped clenching his jaw at 3 a.m. today. That counts." Another, "I will not be the person who makes a ledger of his suffering." That last line was circled, and then struck through, as if she could not fully inhabit the ambition to stop cataloging harm, without becoming complicit in another ledger of her own. Cassidy's visits to Marcus were under the same muted strain. The rehab clinic smelled of antiseptic and bleach-ago memories, and the men there had the variously patient faces of people learning to translate their bodies into new languages. Marcus moved in small increments. His rehabilitation required a patience that did not coincide with immediate results. He lost syllables and gained others back like coins dropped into a fountain. Cassidy coached him in gestures, the focus on a mug, the turn of a wrist toward a small light. She taught him to count with his breath. He would listen to her, and sometimes the body responded. She would leave the session with exhaustion that sat in her shoulders as a comfortable ache. Bramwell's suspicion hardened into an instrument of scrutiny. He accessed footage of Cassidy outside scheduled hours. He had men trace her commute, watch where she put her satchel. He did not like where that surveillance placed him. He thought he wanted answers then, proof. He told himself that his motives were the old, understandable ones, protecting his wife, ensuring nobody used her as leverage. But there was something more private and smaller knotted in him. A fear of exposure not only of his domain, but of the thing he thought it hid. The fact that caring for someone could be more valuable than any ledgers he kept. The first time Bramwell intruded into Cassidy's privacy directly, he felt ashamed before he had act. He found her journal on the living room table one afternoon, its spine face down as if waiting for him to decide a verdict. He slid it open with a guilty reverence, reading a line, then another. The entries were careful and unadorned. Lists of exercises, leaders of programs, names of therapists and their quirks. He found the line about Marcus's counting under the header, Wednesday. He found a neat paragraph with no flourish. Marcus laughed today when I played the lullaby backward. He read that twice and tasted an unfamiliar warmth. Those words did not indict him. They did not call him monster, at least not in language. They named ordinary grief and ordinary labor. And Bramwell, who had spent so much of his life converting his feelings into designs and defenses, found himself ill-equipped to face the blunt tenderness of them. A ledger cannot account for the notations in someone's hand, the days counted by tenderness. He closed the journal, and for the first time saw his surveillance not as a defense, but as an interference in something delicate. If he had the power to make people obey, could he either detect or destroy the quiet acts that did the real work of repair? He told himself next that he would watch more carefully. He told himself he would find any tie between Cassidy and the young man the ledger named, proof of a plot, a mechanism. But the more he watched, the more his suspicion softened into an odd, private curiosity. He noticed the stillness of her hands while she folded a towel, the way she smoothed Evelyn's hair without asking for permission, the small ritual of counting breaths at the bedside. Each act was a careful, practical refusal of the grand gestures he had been taught to deploy. There was no martyrdom in her movements, no self-effacement. There was simply an ethic of repair that refused to be spectacular. Cassidy, aware of being watched in the way all the watched are, an odd humming knowledge that one is part of someone else's instrument, kept her work tightly bounded. She set terms with Bramwell in the first week. No unsolicited updates, only scheduled briefings. No changes to care without mutual agreement, presence valued over gadgets. Bramwell, who liked the sensation of control more than the cost of it, agreed to most of her conditions with a vocabulary of concessions. He set up payments, arranged for auxiliary aids, and, under the surface, began to rechart the house. He left a man at the door in a way that was not, for once, possessive, but more like a sentinel in a line of workers. He made small changes that felt large to him. On a wet Monday, he unplugged one of the bedside cameras and did not tell anyone. The act felt illegally tender. He did not announce the move as though it had been a moral conversion. Rather, he catalogued it mentally. Camera number 3 disabled. He was as much surprised by his own action as by the timid delight he felt when, later, he watched the room and found in the feed a blind spot that allowed privacy for an hour. The Italian lullaby floated through that hour from the sitting room, and Bramwell sat listening at the monitor, counting like someone learning to be present by subtraction, less watching, more attending. Still, the ledger had its momentum. It compelled him toward explanations, even when he noticed the human contentment in small things, like Evelyn managing to sip a warm tea unassisted for the first time in weeks. He insisted on more information about Cassidy's past because ledger thinking seeks causes and assigns responsibilities. He wanted a narrative that fit punishment into pattern. He wanted to categorize Cassidy's motives as either holy or hostile. The photographs pushed that need. Marcus's face was now an index of social debt he had not yet reconciled. Bramwell's organization had made collateral out of people in the peripheries of his concerns before. He had paid and moved on. The journal suggested a cumulative work that demanded more than money. One evening, after a day of watching tape and counting small compassionate acts, Bramwell found Cassidy alone in the hallway folding a towel. Her hands moved fast and efficient, muscles used to repetitions. He watched her not from a room full of monitors, but as he approached, and for the first time his access to her was direct and unmediated by glass. She looked up at him, did not close the towel wholly, and offered the corner without ceremony. "You're doing something I can't quite name," Bramwell said. He tried to keep his voice flat because authority had trained him to neutralize emotion. He wanted her to align with the ledger's categories and be guilty or innocent in tidy ways. Cassidy smiled, not indulgent, not defensive. "I call it work," she said. "I call it showing up, that's all." "How do you know when you've done enough?" he asked, because the ledger needed an outcome as much as an input. She paused, selecting something from beneath the towel she had folded. An old paper bird, its folds softened, ink faded. She set it on the banister as if that might explain things. "You don't," she said. "You just stop when you are run out of time." That answer unsettled him more than any confession would have. He was not run out of time. Time for him was a resource. It could be purchased, guarded, scheduled. He was, however, at risk of learning that presence could not be bought in full, and that some parts of care required him to spend time he did not know how to spare. A crisis of small scale, big only within the psyche of those present, arrived 2 weeks into Cassidy's tenure. Evelyn, who had been practicing a new movement with Cassidy, an attempt to steady a cup in her left hand, had a moment where she coughed, a spasmodic outburst that turned her face ash white. Cassidy moved with the kind of fluid speed Bramwell had once admired in his men. She stood and turned the lamp down, wrapped a blanket around Evelyn's shoulders, and without asking, stroked her forehead until the color returned. Bramwell, who had been watching in the control room, felt the practiced panic rise in his chest. He walked down the stairwell with a pace that was more animal than man. He entered the room in a half stride, hands out like someone expecting to hold a weapon. Cassidy looked up. When two people who tend to be in control meet like that, there is a moment where both measure what the other wants: the right to be useful, the right to be recognized. Bramwell opened his mouth, the ledger ready on his tongue. The first words he wanted to say were accusations. The devices had recorded everything. He could read the footage and point to any fault. Instead, his voice landed on something smaller and more dangerous: concern. "What happened?" he asked, and it seemed suddenly foolish that this query should be an instrument. Cassidy's reply was quick and dry, teacherly. "Bronchial spasm. She's fine. She needed to slow her breaths." She turned the cup with her careful fingers so Evelyn could sip, and the way Evelyn tilted her head, as if acknowledging the offered water, was more than any record could show. Bramwell stood, aware of the monitors behind him and the temptation to turn again to their glow. He thought of the photograph, of the ledger, of the tally of harm. He thought of the small, decisive kindness in Cassidy's hands. "That could have been worse," he said finally, more to the empty space than to her. "It could have been," Cassidy agreed. "It could have been. But you were watching. That's different." The sentence landed between them like a test rather than a judgment. Bramwell wanted to say that watching counted. It had been the way he had learned to love and to prevent being hurt himself. He wanted to argue that watchfulness spared people pain, that the camera's impartial eye had an ethic that practitioners like Cassidy's could never match. But Cassidy met his eyes and, for the first time, demanded that he imagine another currency. "You can watch us," she said, the line precise. "Or you can be with us." He left the room with his hands empty. The monitor's side blue behind him. The ledger had no column for what being with someone required. Bramwell had made bargains, paid off debts, arranged protections. He had not really learned to sit with fragility. He had not learned to bring his hands to a bedside and do the small, repetitive work that was not a transaction. At night he sat again among the screens, but there was a new tension in the air, an awareness that the glass showed motion without necessarily meaning. The monitors could not teach him touch. They could record a cup accidentally toppled and a hand that steadied it, but they could not show the tenacity in a person's little gestures that made life change. He found his fingers unconsciously moving to the small folded bird he had seen Cassidy place on the banister, longing to know why such a small artifact could attract so much care. He began to learn from the ledger of his own habits. In the margins, he wrote aphorisms like payment receipts meant for himself, protection is not the same as presence, surveillance reduces, it names a perimeter instead of people, Money is an oxygen you can pour down a throat, but it does not teach the heart to open. He did not act immediately. Suspicion is a slow-burning thing, unless it is acted on impulsively, and Bramwell had the patience to let his doubts simmer. He began to intensify observation not in the sense of ordering more cameras, but in gathering an idiom of proofs. He had men search for Marcus Webb not to threaten, but to understand who the young man was in the ledger of his life. He wanted to see if Cassidy's photograph was a map to some organized rancor, to find whether this was a grudge or a plea. Yet each time he watched the clips of Cassidy's hands or read another fragment of her journal, the work of mending he had underestimated insisted itself into his view. The watchfulness and the slow kindnesses existed side by side, and the house thrummed between them. Bramwell in the room with the monitors, and Cassidy in the sitting room with her folded paper bird continued their separate ledgers. The house learned to be both surveilled and cared for, and the tension of those two truths, control and repair, made the air vibrate with the possibility of something shifting. The photograph called to him. The sensations of Evelyn's small triumphs called back with equal force. He could have dismissed the photograph as coincidence. He could have fired Cassidy to rid himself of the itch of doubt. He could, as he had in the past, bought the appearance of resolution. But between the ledger and the living, his hands discovered a new equation. Presence alters what proof can make of a life. The thought terrified him as much as it appealed. He began then, in one of those evenings where the monitors threw portraits in blue light across his face, to imagine a different kind of accounting, one where he tracked days spent by a bedside, hours in a clinic, the cost of therapy not merely in money, but in attendance. The next morning Cassidy took her satchel to the clinic where Marcus came for an appointment. Bramwell did not follow at first. Instead, he watched the feet of her leaving the house and thought of the photograph, of the hospital bed with blinds throwing stripes. He paused the clip at the frame where her thumb smoothed the paper's edge, and then began to look through his files for the young man his ledger called an event. There were names and dates, apologies made in memo language, a settlement that read like a sterile patch on a wound. There were also things that reading through an accounting could not reveal. A laugh recorded in a witness statement. A favor returned to the wrong family. He read, and each page was both defense and indictment. He dressed and went to the clinic because curiosity had teeth enough to pull him. The place smelled of lemon cleaner and hope worn thin. Marcus sat with a reluctant stoicism that made him seem at once younger and older than his photograph suggested. He knew Cassidy, said so with a look that had both gratitude and an edge of embarrassment. Bramwell watched them with a man's hunger to categorize them into threat or ally, and found instead a complicated economy. A man who could hold a cup with his left hand, but could not always manage more than 2 words without fatigue. A caregiver who measured progress in soft increments, and who had a satchel full of things that were useful but not glamorous. They spoke in public language. Cassidy introduced Bramwell as someone helping with funding, when Bramwell tried to offer assistance with a hand that felt more like an offering than a demand. Marcus looked at Bramwell with measured calm, the kind that comes from being set into motion by other people's decisions for you. He was plainly neither grateful nor scornful. He was keenly aware of her hands, and the fact that they helped him learn to turn a key, to nudge a cup to his mouth. He had small rituals, counting breaths, turning a song on his phone, tapping the rhythm of a familiar lullaby through his fingers. Cassidy taught him to tap with his thumb, 1, 2, 3, and sometimes the tap resonated in his face like a smile. Bramwell left the clinic with the feeling of an account unsettled. The ledger's columns would not close cleanly here. There was responsibility to take, perhaps, but it was not the only currency at play. Cassidy had been part of a network of people who practiced repair the way a baker practices dough. There was no flash, only the stretch and return and patient time. Bramwell's instinct was not to be the baker, but to write an instruction manual telling bakers which ovens to use. He could not see yet the value of simply standing in a kitchen. When he returned to the house, he made a small, deliberate decision. He would not confront Cassidy with the photograph tonight. He would, instead, speak to Evelyn, sit with her, and learn whether he could bring himself to be the person who spent the hours rather than the man who purchased them. He had meant to find a ledger entry, to reconcile an account. What he found instead was that reconciliation requires a different line of credit, one measured in presence. He sat by Evelyn's bedside and took her hand. She did not always recognize him in the way she had before the illness, but her palm was a landscape his fingertips knew well. He thumbed at the corner of the paper bird Cassidy had left near the lamp, feeling the worn fold between his fingers. Outside, the monitors hummed like a distant tide, and he realized, with a clarity that had not previously occurred to him, that there are things a camera cannot observe. The exact texture of a loved one's breath against your wrist, the smallness of a smile, the nearly invisible trust that starts to register in a face when someone else is present for it every day. He looked at Evelyn and, for the first time in a long while, allowed the idea that his measures of protection were incomplete. The house would continue to hold its blue-lit eyes, of course. Inertia and habit are stubborn. But in that moment, a different conviction settled in him, one whose weight was measured in hours rather than ledgers. That conviction was not yet action. It was a thought folding itself into possibility. And in the room down the hall, Cassidy hummed her lullaby, and the paper bird on the banister trembled in the draft, a tiny, brittle proof that small things can start the work of repair. If this kind of human story interests you, consider subscribing. There are more long-form reckonings like this coming. He did not announce his plans the way he had once announced other things. There were no calls to arms, no proclamations sent through the men who still answered his orders. Instead, Bramwell moved like a man learning a new grammar. Small verbs, low-level commitments, a calendar of hours rather than a ledger of payments. He told no one at first that he intended to meet Marcus again, that he meant to see what could be done beyond the checkbooks and settlements. He unplugged one more camera, camera Nur 7, from the corner above Evelyn's chair, and the bright blue line on his screen receded like tidewater. The absence felt like an admission. Cassidy watched his awkward withdrawals with a caution that had the outline of respect. She had set her terms at the outset not out of theatricality, but out of necessity. Presence first, accounting second, no unilateral changes, and a proper share of dignity for the people under their care. She had not wanted money for Marcus so much as a plan, an institutional frame in which his recovery could continue, one that would not evaporate after a single check cleared. They negotiated in the kitchen because the kitchen was a room both of transaction and habit. Bramwell arrived with a thin leather portfolio that held papers he had always used to make things official. Cassidy came with her satchel and a roll of entries from her notebook folded like talismans. They sat across from one another at a table that remembered long conversations, and the house hummed in the outer rooms with thermostats, staff footfalls, the muffled sound of the monitors now turned low. "Tell me what you need," Bramwell said. His voice wanted to be practical, an accountant balancing an entry, but under the calculation their eyes kept roaming to where Evelyn slept. Cassidy made no immediate list. She counted off on her fingers as if counting exercises. 1. Consistent presence. That could mean you or someone you designate who commits a set number of hours per week. 2. Sustained funding but tied to programs, not merely checks. We need speech therapy, physical therapy, at least a year of vocational training for Marcus. 3. Privacy. You dismantle or repurpose any surveillance inside the home that isn't strictly clinical. No secret feeds. 4. An oversight board. Not your men, not your ledger. People who know recovery work and who come from the neighborhoods affected. 5. Employment pathways for Marcus and men like him. She paused. And 6. Training for the people who work for you. If they are going to be caretakers in the community, they must learn how to be. Her voice was lower now. Her eyes were on the wooden grain of the table. I am not asking you to undo your life. I'm asking you to commit to the things that actually repair harm. Bramwell listened with the old instinct to translate everything into cost. His ledger's columns swam before his eyes. Line items, accountant's hours, the little arithmetic of influence. He had previously been excellent at transforming harm into numbers, and then throwing numbers at the people harmed. Cassidy's list would not be cleaned by a signature. It wanted him to be present. Work hours, Bramwell said, and watched like a man at sea who had thrown out a phrase to steady himself. You want me to sit in clinics? No. Cassidy's half-smile was wry. I want you to be reliably inconvenient, show up where it matters, fund programs that last beyond a single anniversary, remove cameras that make people feel watched when they're at their most vulnerable, make a small board with people who will not simply say yes to your checkbook. And if you can't come yourself, pick someone who can. You have people who will, but they must be accountable and trained to the work. Bramwell's first offers were fits of his old economy. Money, renovations to the clinic, a larger prosthetic for Marcus's adaptive devices. Cassidy accepted the offers but rebuked the spirit behind them. Money, she insisted, without structures, becomes a show. You're good at shows, she said. Try something that isn't staged. He underwrote a clinic wing before he understood why it mattered, then learned that the wing meant less if no therapists could be retained. He set up a fund, and the first quarter evaporated into consulting fees and branded plaques. He learned how easily philanthropic gestures could be consumed by prestige. The men in his circle congratulated him for his largesse. They did not see the slow, unglamorous bureaucracy that sucked at the edges of good intentions. He also learned that insisting on presence was harder than money. The first time he attempted to keep his 2-hour Thursday commitment, sitting through one of Marcus's occupational therapy sessions, he arrived ill-prepared. He asked questions in the tone of a man used to getting the right answers. When the therapist used a phrase he did not know, a queuing method, a tolerance schedule, his face closed. Cassidy watched him from across the room, the lullaby low in her mouth. Marcus responded to Cassidy's hands with a small accuracy of gesture, and Bramwell felt like an intruder in a language he did not understand. Yet he returned. He came back on another day and held a mug for a patient who struggled to turn the handle. He learned to breathe in a room of small defeats. Between his awkward sessions, he wrote aphorisms in the margins of a blank book that had once been a ledger. These lines were not for public viewing. They were his way of taking stock. Protection is not the same as presence, he wrote in a cramped hand one night. Money is an oxygen you can pour down a throat, but it does not teach the heart to open. Time does not lend you moral authority unless you spend it. The entries read like confessions that had yet to become acts. Cassidy's journal, by contrast, unfolded in a different voice, methodical, luminous in its accumulated detail. She would tuck a sentence into a corner. Marcus turned his wrist to the right today. There was a flicker at the base of his thumb, and then moved to the next item as if nothing remarkable had happened. Her entries were punctuated by small circled statements. He tolerated the sound of the kettle for 4 minutes. She refused epiphanies and favored continuities. One evening she left the journal open on the kitchen table. No one had touched it except a night nurse who had cleared the area. Bramwell did not look at the pages as an invasion in the way he once had. Instead, he read them with the reverence of someone discovering a litany he could not quantify. There were sentences that almost read like bargains. Marcus will come to the center at 9. We will try a new cue. He smiled at a song today. The entries did not demand his approval. They were records of repair that refused to be owned. The first institutional pushback came not from Cassidy, but from within Bramwell's ranks. There were men who had followed him through contracts that had bled into other people's lives, men who had been rewarded for their efficiency and their ability to keep operations tidy. They were, in some cases, unprepared to be transformed into caregivers and community workers. Some bristled at the suggestion that they attend training sessions to learn to transfer a cup without patronization. Others mocked the idea that a surveillance room could be turned into anything except a watchtower. Bramwell called a meeting in the same dim office where he had once received men with clipped nods. The talk began with numbers, budgets for training, projected retention rates of vocational placements, because when he had to, he defaulted to arithmetic. But he also spoke of other things that did not fit columns: the shape of Evelyn's hand, the way Cassidy counted breaths with Marcus, the smallness of the successes that had shifted his nights. He did not order his men to become saints. He asked them to learn to be useful in a different register. Some left. Pride ran a sharp clip through a few of the older ones. They preferred the clarity of a world where control had masculine edges, and no one asked them to fold a towel with gentleness. Others stayed, grumbling but present, and the men who stayed would become the first cohort for the training program Cassidy designed with a local therapist. They learned to speak the language of care the way one learns a new dialect, often clumsy at first, with false starts and mispronunciations, but gradually with less self-consciousness. None of it was seamless. Bramwell made a public show, an inaugural grant and a plaque, before the structures had teeth, and the photo op brought predictable flack. Cassidy refused to stand beside him to have her name printed next to his. She accepted the fund, yes, but she would not allow the narrative to be shaped into a clean redemption tale at his expense. Marcus's progress stalled when a therapist left for a job in another city, and another therapist had to pick up the rhythm. Evelyn had nights where she forgot the shape of words, and days where her left hand trembled more than usual. Each setback threatened to undo the fragile seams they had begun to stitch. One fracture that almost closed the loop prematurely came in the form of an unexpected leak. Rumors that Bramwell's organization was coercing families to accept their programs in exchange for favors. They had been planted by men who saw no virtue in the change, and a hazard to their own stability if the old ways eroded. Cassidy received an anonymous call asking her to kick off the program entirely. She brought the message to Bramwell without theatrics and with no plea for dramatic confrontation. The call, she said, was a reminder that change makes people uneasy, and not only the people who had been harmed. He took the call as an accusation and for a time reverted to his old habit of employing force to quiet dissent. He arranged for a few of his older associates to be reassigned to projects that would, he hoped, keep them from sabotaging progress. The reassignments looked too much like punishments and were poorly received. One of the men who had been moved lashed out in private and said things that made Cassidy bristle. Bramwell had to relearn that power used without explanation breeds suspicion rather than loyalty. He began to hold small meetings where he explained, without grandeur, his intentions and the boundaries of the work. He also admitted, awkwardly and without flourish, that he would make mistakes. Cassidy kept her own guard. She had not come to the house to be a symbol of forgiveness. She had come because the work needed someone who understood the ordinary daily requirements of care. She refused to be complicit in any narrative that made her forgiveness a balm for Bramwell's conscience. She set smaller tests for him: show up for an hour and sit at the back of an occupational therapy group, attend the staff training and listen without interrupting, allow a public oversight panel to ask uncomfortable questions about funding. Bramwell failed some of them spectacularly. He would, at times, show up late and talk about logistics instead of listening. He would, at other moments, surprise them by bringing sandwiches and sitting quietly, allowing the men at the clinic to eat without being counted as a charity recipient. The work of retraining men in respect was granular. Cassidy staged a session where men were asked to simulate being the patient. Eyes closed, hands sensitive to touch. Several men scoffed at first, but then engaged with a decency that surprised them. One night, a tall man who had never cried in public sat with a trembling patient and simply held a hand. The patient sobbed quietly, not because the man had eloquence, but because the hand was steady, and steady hands are a rare currency in places where people are used to being told how to be invisible. Marcus's arc was slower and more jagged than anyone had predicted. He learned to place his fingers on a cup rim and not panic when it slipped. He learned to ride a short tricycle in a therapy yard, wobbling and then finding a rhythm. His voice returned in fragments and songs. He liked a pop ballad that Cassidy used in therapy, the melody of which allowed him to time his breathing to a beat. On a morning in late winter, he tapped his thumb aloud in the waiting room and surprised himself by keeping 4 beats of rhythm. It was not showy. No one filmed it. But when he did it, his face relaxed in a way that had nothing to do with a camera, and everything to do with the small internal measure of achievement. The moment belonged solely to him and the chorus of caregivers who had been patient enough to count his breaths. The turning point, less a thunderclap than a long, slow softening, occurred one dawn that smelled of rain and warm bread. Evelyn had been practicing gripping a cup with her left hand for weeks. The days came when her fingers tightened and then slipped. She practiced under Cassidy's steady count, then rested. Bramwell had promised to be present that morning. He arrived with a thermos of tea that had gone lukewarm by the time he entered the sitting room. Cassidy handed him a towel and an instruction that felt simpler than it was. Hold the cup steady when she raises it. He did not know how heavy such a task could feel. When Evelyn's hand hovered, small as a drawn sail, Bramwell's own hand moved like a ledger trying to balance its first humane account. He steadied the cup at an angle as instructed, and Evelyn's thumb found the rim. She lifted slowly, her lips meeting the liquid, and for a sick, ordinary second, there was a continuity that cameras could not render into proof. She swallowed. The room inhaled. Then she did something so small and so human that it made everyone near her shift their footing, as if adjusting to new weather. When the song Cassidy hummed, an Italian lullaby that had passed from therapist to patient to man in a control room, reached the line where the melody made a small step, Evelyn tapped her index finger on the cup in time. It was not more than a rhythmic bruise against ceramic, but the tap matched Cassidy's hum, and Marcus, who had been in the corner practicing a different exercise, stopped and laid his palm on the table, cued by the beat. For a moment, they were 3 people connected by the faint, patient rhythm of presence. A caregiver humming, a recovering woman making a tiny gesture, a young man answering with the same beat. Bramwell's hands curled into fists he did not notice. The monitors, which had been reduced to an afterthought in his mind, hummed in the room down the hall. He had expected heroics or a dramatic showdown. Instead, he had a tap, a slow, accurate proof that repair is often tactile, and that meaning is sometimes made in small, repeatable acts. He let his head fall forward in his hands, and allowed the salt of something like grief and relief to flood him. The ledger in him made a tiny new entry he did not intend to record for anyone. Presence yields gestures. They did not collapse into a single narrative afterward. There were still negotiations to be had, trainings to be held, funds to distribute in accountable ways. Cassidy insisted on the formation of an oversight board made up of therapists, community elders, a representative from the clinic, and one person who had been harmed by Bramwell's world. A choice Bramwell made with visible discomfort, but eventual acceptance. The board met in the repurposed surveillance room, a space Bramwell had emptied of its banks of equipment and turned into a long table strewn with rehabilitation charts and community art. The monitors that had once watched the house now displayed local artists' work and instructional videos about caregiving techniques. Men who once sat before those monitors now sat at the table, learning how to read therapy notes. Bramwell's transformation was never total. He sometimes slipped back into transactional thinking, offering money to solve social problems that were not amenable to neat purchases. Once, frustrated with the slow pace of a funding application, he tried to leverage influence to expedite a filing and was rebuked by Cassidy and the oversight panel. The rebuke was not theatrical. It was a correction given by people who had to live with the consequences. Bramwell learned slowly to let some things be slow. His aphorisms in the margins grew longer and less certain. "Presence is an expense I am not always willing to pay," he wrote. "Sometimes the cost is me." Cassidy kept her own distance. She did not become an emblem of charity. She argued fiercely with Bramwell about how programs were run and refused to be a window-dressing presence at ribbon cuttings. She accepted payment for her work and insisted on autonomy in hiring decisions. She sometimes read passages from her journal out loud at meetings, not as a plea, but as a demonstration of the ordinary ledger of care that needed to be honored. Appointments kept, meals tolerated, songs that helped with breath. Her journal entries remained free of moralizing. They were inventories of endurance. Marcus received apprenticeships that first autumn. One placement was in the repurposed surveillance room, now a studio, where he learned to fix small electronics under the tutelage of a man who had once wired parts of Bramwell's old networks. The irony was not lost on anyone. Marcus's hands, once trembling from trauma, learned circuitry and assembled tiny projects that illuminated small LED birds. Cassidy, dry-eyed, laughed the first time a bird blinked, and Marcus said plainly, "It's mine." He did not demand an audience for his recovery. He asked for work that made sense and the dignity that comes from a regular schedule and pay. The public face of Bramwell's shift was uneven. Reporters came once for a photo of a ribbon and a statement. They painted strokes of praise and suspicion in equal measure. Some community members welcomed the change with guarded optimism. Others, who had been harmed in deeper ways, remained skeptical. Cassidy acknowledged both responses. She set up listening circles and was careful to include people whose lives had been injured by Bramwell's world. The oversight panel included a woman whose cousin had been hurt in a night Bramwell had once ordered. Her presence made conversations thorny and genuine. Bramwell learned not to seek forgiveness as a product, but to accept accountability in process. Years did not erase the house's history. They thinned its edges. The surveillance room became a gathering place where therapists taught classes, and men from neighborhood streets learned trades. The monitors that once mapped every shiver that passed through the sitting room now displayed photographs taken by students at the community center. One screen showed Marcus's LED birds arranged in a small constellation. Another played a loop of caregivers demonstrating how to coax hands into holding tools. The ledger in Bramwell's drawer still existed, but its margins were filled with other marks. Hours spent in clinics, the number of trainees retained, the count of home visits logged. Evelyn's course of recovery remained partial. She did not recover the full lexicon of old conversation. She never again walked the length of the apartment without help, and some days were harder than others. But there were steady enrollments of days that were better. A plate carried without dropping, a line from a poem read aloud with comprehension, a laugh that came without prompting. Her small triumphs were lived and witnessed more than they were recorded, and Bramwell learned to sit with the fact that not every narrative finishes with a tidy reconciliation. The house, louder now with visitors and classes, took on a lived quality that even his monitors could not have predicted. Perhaps the deepest change was not an institutional one, but a personal rearrangement in Bramwell's life. He softened along a vector that was chastened and practical. His aphorisms became less epigrammatic and more like inventory. I still have impulses to control. I will make mistakes, but I will also show up for small acts. He kept his hands busy with the work he had once delegated, folding towels, learning how to coax a spoon into a strapped hand, listening to a confused complaint from someone his men had once moved through without hearing. He did not stop being an authority figure, but he learned to make his authority less about dominion and more about repair. Cassidy, for her part, remained a composite of compassion and boundary. She accepted Bramwell's attendance and rejected his attempts at theatrical redemption. She trained men who now served as caregivers in the neighborhood and ran a schedule of groups for families affected by trauma. She kept her journal, adding small notations. Marcus accepts the job. He is nervous but steady. Evelyn knew the lullaby's line today and tapped 3 times. The entries were modest beacons that marked the slow arc of repair. On the day that would later be pointed to, awkwardly by friends and critics alike, as a turning point, nothing dramatic happened. No single press conference occurred. There was, instead, a Tuesday in late spring, when the sun leaned through the blinds in a way that made all the dust motes seem like congregants. Evelyn sat in the sitting room with Cassidy at her left and Bramwell at her right. Marcus had stopped by between shifts and was seated by the window, fingers tucked under his chin. Cassidy hummed the lullaby softly, the notes a familiar pulse. They practiced a small task that day, the ritual of opening the window to let air in and then closing it again. It was a minor domestic choreography. The hand extends, the thumb finds the latch, the wrist turns. Evelyn's left hand reached for the latch as if remembering a route. Her fingers lingered and then, with a steadier motion than the week before, she turned the latch and pushed the window an inch. The movement was deliberately small, practiced and precise. When the window gave the bit of air it took, Evelyn laughed, a short, surprised sound, and then, as if in answer, tapped the rim of her cup twice in time with the final phrase of the lullaby. Marcus, who had been tapping his own rhythm under a table, matched the beat. Bramwell let out a breath he had been holding for years and felt every old division soften infinitesimally. The house, for a second, was not a place of guarded thresholds and blue-lit screens. It was a room where people met their small tasks together. The moment contained no epiphany about his past. The ledger was not erased. There remained debts he had not made right, and histories that would not be undone by a single cup or a tap. But it contained proof of another kind, that a life could be altered by the repetition of attending and by the willingness to accept the ineffable friction of being present. Bramwell placed his palm on the table and did what he had come to do. He counted. He counted breaths with Cassidy and Marcus, not as an owner but as someone learning to keep time. Years later, there would be a mural in the repurposed room, a band of people humming a lullaby that wound through the town like a ribbon. Marcus's LED birds would be displayed in a glass case in the community center. Some would light up when a visitor pressed a button. Bramwell's contribution would be visible in the building's named wing and in the budgets that maintained therapists' positions. He would not be praised by all, and some would continue to see the work as an attempt to assuage a conscience. That was inevitable. Redemption, in any sensible reading, is noisy and incomplete. It does not arrive neat. Cassidy almost always sat near the center of this new geography, but never at its center in the ways the press or Bramwell's men might have wished. She took no public boos. She accepted thanks with a brow slightly furrowed. She maintained boundaries with the intensity of someone who had seen how easily tasks of care become instruments in other people's moral stories. She kept Marcus's apprenticeship close and signed its paychecks. She made sure that he was neither romanticized as a triumph nor erased as a cost. Bramwell kept his old reflexes. He still checked a door lock with the same speed and still counted the hours. But the reflexes softened with retrievals of patient gestures. Once, when a neighbor accused his men of a small transgression, Bramwell did what he had never done before. He listened for an hour without interrupting, then arranged restitution that involved community labor rather than a cash settlement. It was messy. It was slow. It also built an odd, brittle trust. The house remained a house with creaks and disagreements. Men who had once been comfortable in shadows sometimes slipped back. Cassidy disciplined them and then helped re-educate them. Bramwell sanctioned them and then tried to make reparations when words had failed. It was not a moral fairy tale. It was a slow rearrangement of habits into something more durable than defense, into care. At the end, the monitors were silent more often than they had been. The bank of screens that had once reflected Bramwell's face like a pale congregation now displayed other images. A rotating shot of a child making a paper bird in a workshop, Marcus assembling tiny lights, a close-up of hands folding towels. The screen still occasionally flicked to a feed if a therapist needed an observational reference, but the feeds were clinical, consented to, and scheduled. Bramwell had made a physical concession that mirrored the interior one. Surveillance would no longer be the default posture of love in that house. On evenings when the city settled and the lamps cast long fingers across the floorboards, Bramwell would sit in the room where the monitors once were and thumb through his old ledger. Lines in the margins had softened. Some pages had been torn out and burned, not in a spectacle but in private, small piles. He kept the leather book not as a talisman but as a reminder that accounting is useful but insufficient. Once, he wrote a final note across a page. "Presence is the ledger I wish to balance daily." He left no flourish. He left the sentence there like a receipt. Cassidy continued to write in hers. Her entries were shorter now and often ended with a notation of a ritual. Marcus took a bus alone today. Evelyn tapped the cup at the right beat twice. She argued at the oversight meeting for transparency, for holding men who had power to the same small daily tasks she had always required. She never claimed Bramwell's conversion as her victory. She claimed only the work. Years later, when visitors asked Marcus what changed him most, he would smile and point to the blinking birds in the studio and say, "People came to my table and waited." It was not a tidy aphorism, but it was true. Waiting had been a kind of demand of respect in a culture that had often denied him the luxury of being taken seriously. The house learned new rhythms: classes in the afternoons, visits from families, simple meals shared at long tables. Laughter came not in the thunderous ways of old parties, but in measured increments, the small, bright sound of someone discovering a thing their body could do. Surveillance had become one of many rooms in a house that had widened to allow for more people. In the end, nothing in Bramwell's world converted overnight. There were audits and accusations, long meetings and slow funding cycles. Some people left and never forgave. Others welcomed the small changes and kept returning. The world beyond their walls did not immediately shift. Yet within the house, and in the community of which it was a part, a different script began to be legible. Mistakes could be accounted for not only in harsh ledger terms, but in a grammar of repair that asked for presence, training, and continuity. On a mild evening many seasons later, Bramwell sat alone for a while in the repurposed room. The monitors tuned to an old family video of Evelyn and him on a seaside trip they had taken before illness. Her laugh, captured in sun and salt, was a thing he kept like a currency he could not spend. He touched the paper bird that had once been folded by Cassidy and later kept in a box labeled "Small Proofs." The house breathed around him, not a held breath, but a series of measured exhalations. The clink of a cup, a soft laughter from the studio, a man teaching another to solder. He had not become an exemplar. He had become a man still tethered to many of his old inclinations, but learning to accept the friction of being present rather than the ease of buying his assurances. Cassidy kept her distance and her work, and Marcus kept his job in a place that employed more than his hands. It gave him hours and modest pride. Evelyn continued to have better days and worse ones, and in one corner of the room there was a small display of LED birds that blinked in an irregular choreography when someone pulled a cord. The monitors that remained were used now as instruments for teaching, not surveillance. The cameras installed for clinical reasons were consented to and made transparent. The house's past was not erased. The conversations about it continued, less defensive, more honest. The repurposed watchroom was busy with meetings that brought together men who had once been enemies and young therapists who had studied the language of recovery. It was a place where sometimes Bramwell sat in the back and listened. He touched the paper bird one last time and, with a clean, ledger-like economy, filed a final small note into his own book. "I will keep showing up." It was not an absolution. It was a commitment. Outside, the city continued with its old debts and small mercies. Inside, the house had shifted by degrees, a sequence of steps as measured and fallible as counting breaths. And in its soft public failures, it achieved something steadier than spectacle. It learned to keep time with the people it held. Which moment moved you most? The photograph in the satchel, the confrontation in the sitting room, the first time she tapped the cup, or the conversion of the monitor room into something else? Share in the comments, and subscribe for more long-form stories about reckonings and quiet change.